Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Ron's Amazing Stories. We have stories that should thrill you a little and chill you a little.
It's amazing.
You will hear adventures sent in by you guys, classic stories from the pulp mags, and episodes from the golden age of radio. We have special segments like Ghost Stories with Sylvia.
That's amazing.
And the Paranormal with Jason.
I think we're going to have a lot of fun.
So settle in for the next hour and enjoy the show. Oh, and you just might want to prepare yourself to be taken away from today.
Another 5-minute mystery.
This 5-minute mystery is being brought to you by the unknown. There are things known and there are things unknown, and in between are the doors of perception. Let's see how that applies to our story.
This must be a big case we're headed for, Inspector.
Well, you're right in a way, Stokes. I've known old Sherry, the man who's been murdered, for a long time.
Isn't he the guy who owned a lot of diamonds?
Yes, he had several very valuable ones in his collection. And I think somebody killed Sherry for those diamonds.
Any idea who?
We'll find that out after we get inside.
Oh, hello, Inspector Crothers. I'm glad you got here so soon.
Oh, hello, Dr. Matthews. I brought Sergeant Stokes along to help.
Fine. Come on in, won't you? The man who phoned me, Mr. Sayers, is in the study where they found Sherry.
We'll come along after you, Doctor.
Inspector Crothers, this is Mr. Sayers who found Mr. Sherry unconscious when he came in.
How do you do, Mr. Sayers?
Holy Moses, look at this place. Looks as though a cyclone had struck it.
Now, tell us what happened, won't you, Mr. Sayers? I'd like to get the story straight.
Well, in a very confidential capacity, I represent a large diamond buying syndicate. Mr. Sherry was known to have a very extensive collection of gems, one specimen in particular that our firm wanted to buy.
And you were sent to see if he would sell it?
That's right. I made an appointment with Mr. Sherry for this evening. He said to come here and that he might be back here in the study and not hear the bell. If no one answered, I was to come right in. He would leave the door unlocked for me.
Isn't that a rather strange thing for a man to do who has a valuable collection of diamonds in his house?
Well, I thought so at the time, but I thought also that Mr. Sherry was perhaps, well, eccentric. You see, I'd never met him, nor, as a matter of fact, heard of him until yesterday. I come from another part of the country, you see.
And he was alone?
Completely. You can imagine how shocked I was at finding Mr. Sherry lying on the floor by the desk, unconscious, and the room all upset.
When Mr. Sayers phoned me, I imagined that Sherry was suffering from one of his chronic attacks. However, I find that the man has been hit at the base of the skull by a powerful blow, breaking his neck and killing him instantly.
You say you were familiar with Mr. Sherry's chronic attacks, Doctor?
Yes, I've been Mr. Sherry's personal physician for many years.
That was why I phoned Dr. Matthews, Inspector. I knew that he would be able to offer the best help.
Mr. Sayers, your theory is a very nicely calculated one. In fact, I would have acted on it if it hadn't been for one thing. As it is, though, I'm holding you for the murder of Mr. Sherry and for the attempted theft of his diamond collection.
What mistake did Sayers make that caused the inspector to hold him on a definite charge of murder? In just a moment, we'll tell you, but first...
Well, it appears to me that there is much here that is unknown, but what do we actually know? Oh, heck, there's too much unknown stuff that the rest is lost in what is known. I suspect he probably said something that he should not have known. Let's go see.
And now, back to our 5-minute mystery.
Hold me for murder? Why, Inspector, I told you...
I know, Mr. Sayers, you told me a little too much. When you said you had never met Sherry, nor heard of him until a day ago, everything was fine. But when you said you called his personal physician purposely, you caught yourself. If you knew nothing about Sherry, you couldn't have known who his personal physician was.
Say, Inspector, that's pretty clever. Pretty clever.
right. He might have gotten away with murder if he had pretended that he didn't know more about the dead guy than he actually did know. Confused? Well, less is more. This 5-Minute Mystery was brought to you by The Unknown.
Is that you say?
Welcome to The Unknown, that is Ron's Amazing Stories. Why do I call it The Unknown when in fact it is known to me?
Are you trying to confuse me?
Well, yes and no. You see, the unknown comes from our stories today. We have a strange missing person case, lost time in a Cessna, and a creepy tale from the Mojave Desert.
Doesn't that sound great?
It would if that's all we had.
There must be more.
There is. We have a brand new
Johnny, is this true?
and a classic Pulp Mag story that was made into a Twilight Zone episode.
Wow!
Yep, it should be a pretty good show. One of the bad things that has come out of COVID-19 is the increase in spam, spoof emails, and people trying to give me money.
Oh, I know that one. Dearly beloved, I find myself with money that my government wishes to take from me. I would rather give it to you to hold until this crisis passes.
Yep, that's the one. The problem is that I have folks say that they have sent me stories and questions that I haven't responded to. Unfortunately, my guess is these may have been lost in the sea of spam. Please, when you send me an email, make sure that it has a subject. Also, if you want to make sure I get your comments and stories, use the contact tab or submission form located on the website at ronsamazingstories.com. I do apologize to anyone that has felt that I'm ignoring them. I really don't do that. As you know, we have 2 great chat segments, Ghost Stories with Sylvia and The Paranormal with Jason. I'm looking for some help with these programs. Sylvia, Jason, and myself love your comments and your questions. So if you have something you want to ask, say, or suggest for us to talk about, please do. Again, simply use the contact forms on the main webpage. I'm not very good at using social media, and I know I need to get better. What I'd like to see is more interactions on the various platforms. But honestly, I don't know how to do it. If there's someone out there that would like to help me learn or would like to help promote the show, please contact me and let's talk. My dream for Ron's Amazing Stories is to have it go viral. And I mean that in a good way. And now we have this from Audible. Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories. They have over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, computer, Kindle. Whatever you have, you can definitely listen to Audible on it. So what am I listening to right now? One of my favorite stories of all time is Ender's Game, written by Orson Scott Card. I have read the book, loved the 2013 movie, and have now listened to the Audible version. Of the 3, I have to say that one is the best. Why? Well, listen to this.
"This won't take long, Andrew," said the doctor. Ender nodded. "It's designed to be removed without infection, without damage, but there'll be some tickling, and some people say they have a feeling of something missing. You'll keep looking around for something you were looking for, but you can't find it and you can't remember what it was. So I'll tell you, it's the monitor you're looking for and it isn't there. In a few days, that feeling will pass." The doctor was twisting something at the back of Ender's head. Suddenly, a pain stabbed through him like a needle. from his neck to his groin. Ender felt his back spasm, and his body arched violently backward. His head struck the bed. He could feel his legs thrashing, and his hands were clenching each other, wringing each other so tightly that they arched. "Dee Dee," shouted the doctor, "I need you." The nurse ran in, gasped. "Got to relax these muscles. Get it to me, now. What are you waiting for?" Something changed hands. Ender could not see. He lurched to one side and fell off the examining table. "Catch him!" cried the nurse. "Just hold him steady. You hold him, doctor. He's too strong for me. Not the whole thing. You'll stop his heart." Ender felt a needle enter his back just above the neck of his shirt. It burned. But wherever in him the fire spread, his muscles gradually unclenched. Now he could cry for the fear and pain of it. "Are you all right, Andrew?" the nurse asked. Andrew could not remember how to speak. They lifted him onto the table. They checked his pulse, did other things. He did not understand it all. The doctor was trembling. His voice shook as he spoke. "They leave these things in the kids for 3 years. What did they expect? We could have switched him off. Do you realize that? We could have unplugged his brain for all time." "When does the drug wear off?" asked the nurse. "Keep him here for at least an hour. Watch him. If he doesn't start talking in 15 minutes, call me. Could have unplugged him forever. I don't have the brains of a bugger."
Ender's Game tells the story of Andrew Ender Wiggin. The war with the buggers has been raging for 100 years, and the quest for the perfect general has been underway for almost as long. Is Andrew the answer to decades of genetic experimentation? His story tells us the answer. Ender's Game was written in 1985 and is a military science fiction novel written by Orson Scott Card. It has won both the Hugo and Nebula Awards for Best Science Fiction Story and truly is a work of art. You can have this book today. Here is what Audible has set up for us. Audible is offering a free audiobook and 30 days to give you the opportunity to check out their service. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories. Again, that's audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories, and you can have Ender's Game today. Thank you, Audible. And now, it's time for your stories.
These are your stories, sent by you, for you.
This time, we're going to have stories from the unknown. But what does that mean? Are any of the stories we have on the show ever really known? Probably not. These 3 listeners' stories take us one step further to a place that is truly beyond anything we can imagine. Even our storytellers this time aren't so sure. How did I get here? Time lost. And what did I just see are all things that we will explore this week. Our first story comes from a set of twins, Eva and Ella Stone from Pikeville, Kentucky. Now, if that town rings a bell or two, it should. Members of the Hatfield and the McCoy feud are buried in the town's Dill Cemetery, including Randolph McCoy, head of the McCoy family during the feud. However, it is a horse trail called the Pikeville Cut-Through Overlook that is the site of our adventure. Here is Eva's story. Hello, Ron. Thank you for allowing me to share my story. This occurred when we were 16 years old. I won't say how long ago this was in fear of giving away my sister's age. She's very sensitive about such things. Ella and I had just celebrated our birthday. We were given matching Western saddles and planned a trip to the park to test them out. Even at the young age of 16 years old, we were both experienced riders. My interests were in rodeo sport, barrel racing to be exact, and Ellie, well, she's an expert equestrian. While Western saddles were not her thing, we both used them a lot in our daily outings. We decided to go through the Pikeville cut-through. I would be riding Marcus, and Ella would ride Stardust. It's a wonderful trip to the Overlook. From there you can see the great Sandy River, home of the Hatfields and McCoys. On the way back, we decided to split up. I wanted to take the high country route, and Ella just wanted to ride. We would meet back at Hatfield Creek in 30 minutes. I arrived at the bridge, but Ella wasn't there. I waited 10 minutes, then 20, then finally 30 minutes. This was too long, so I decided to backtrack our trail to where we split up. In a small meadow, I found Stardust calmly grazing. I checked her out and saw nothing amiss. It was as if Ella had simply left the horse and went off on foot. I called out her name. No response. By now I was starting to get a bit frantic. There were no cell phones in those days, so I grabbed Stardust's reins and rode around calling Ella's name. Another 30 minutes went by, and my fears were growing. Had she been thrown? Was she abducted? Was she still alive? It was then I felt a chill go through my body. I realized for the first time I couldn't feel Ella. I can't explain it. It was as if she didn't exist. I finally rode back to the trailer. There was a payphone there, and I called home to my dad. He said that they were on the way and that I should call the police. I dialed 911, and within 20 minutes there were at least 20 people on horses ready to search for my sister. 3 hours went by. It was late afternoon, and I still had that empty feeling. Where was Ella? I was riding up a hill with my brother Evan. We reached the top to get a view of the area in hopes of seeing something. I got off Stardust, who I was now riding, to look around. Suddenly, I felt as if I had been struck by lightning. I can't explain it any better than that. Evan saw me shake and grabbed me to keep me from falling over. All at once, I could feel Ella again, and once more I knew where she was. I tried to explain it to Evan, and all he said was, "I don't understand, but let's go." We rode at a frantic pace back to the meadow where I had first found Stardust. Sitting on a large boulder was Ella. I literally jumped off my horse, ran to her, and hugged her tightly. After Evan got into the act, we got around to asking Ella where she had been. All she could say is that she had been right here. She wanted to know why I was riding Stardust, how Evan got here, and why I was so emotional. We told her the story. At first, she didn't believe it, but when the sun finally dipped below the tree line, it was clear to even Ella that several hours had passed. Ella and I rode double back to the trailer, and the sheriff radioed the rest of the search party that we had found her. Ella went home with my mom and dad, and Evan and I got Marcus and Stardust into the trailer. As I took the saddles off the horses, I noticed something strange. The two matching Western saddles didn't match. I could have sworn they were identical, but there it was. My saddle had gold buckles, and Ella's had silver. Had I missed this before? I don't see how I could have. I asked Evan about it, and he just wasn't sure. My parents didn't understand it either because they were sure they matched. To this day, Ella says for her, no time had passed. She's not sure, and it scares her to even think about it. For me, losing that feeling of Ella, I can't explain it. It's something I never want to feel again. I think only twins can understand what I mean. Eva Stone, Pikeville, Kentucky. Eva, that truly is a special story. I am not a twin, but I think I can understand what you're saying. I don't know how to explain these events, and the subtle differences only adds to the intrigue. I will have to file this under the unknown, and thank you for sharing it with us. Now, I couldn't let this one go by without doing some research, so I decided to look up just what this Pikeville cut-through is. It turns out it's an overlook that can't be overlooked. The Pikeville cut-through project is an astonishing engineer wonder that has been called the 8th wonder of the world by the New York Times. Spearheaded by former Mayor William C. Hambley, the Pikeville cut-through project officially began in November of 1973 with the purpose of relieving the barrage of flooding that the city has experienced each year prior. It provided the city of Pikeville with more room for development due to the relocation of the Lavisa Fork of the Big Sandy River away from downtown Pikeville, and also relieve the city of congestion caused by the railroad and the 3 major highways that pass through it. The project was completed in 4 phases spanning 14 years and cost approximately $80 million. How about that? Our next story is one of my favorites from Podcast Past. It's a lost time story from Texas via Atlanta, Georgia. Confused? Let's unravel this mystery with this one from Jim Richards. He currently resides in Atlanta, but claims that his roots are firmly placed in Fort Worth, Texas. Jim is a private pilot working for his very own airline. Jim wanted me to tell you that he's not crazy, not prone to general seizures, and does not take drugs or alcohol. Here is Jim's story titled The Perfect Flight. I am a private pilot just like you see on television. I hire myself out for parties, special freight, and I take passengers just about anywhere they want to go. I own 2 planes. The first is a Cessna Skyhawk for those quick deliveries and flights. The second is a Cessna Caravan for larger groups and cargo. I have over 30 years flight experience, and I've logged more hours than Chuck Yeager. Okay, I'm not really sure about that second claim. I've seen a lot of strange things up there, most of which can be explained. Once, while flying a heart waiting for transplant from Austin to Dallas, my plane was bracketed by a series of lights. The medtech that was with me saw them as well. They seemed to be following us, then, abruptly, they disappeared. I was never able to determine what it was. I think the medtech had the best explanation. He thought it was the heart's original owner saying goodbye. This type of thing is common and doesn't worry me much. However, what happened on the last day of August in 1996 will haunt me forever. I did not fly for an entire year after that day. I'd been contracted to fly some dailies for a major film company to Houston for review by its director. In case you're wondering, I'm purposely not using the names. I was on the clock. There would be a bonus of $600 if I got the film there by 6 p.m. It was going to be tight, but if everything fell into place, I would have a steak dinner that night at the Papa Bros, the best steakhouse in Houston. The flight started out as normal can be. I would be flying alone, no extra cargo, and limited fuel to make the plane as light as possible. I had the flight plan, Fort Wayne to Houston, with a short stop in DFW for fuel and rest. The pre-checks were done, and I was waiting in line, looking good. It was a beautiful summer day, no clouds, and unlimited visibility. Perfect conditions. You couldn't ask for better. The first leg of the trip went without incident. I made it to Dallas-Fort Worth Airport in record time. That steak was starting to look pretty good. I was back in the air in less than 30 minutes. I was about 45 minutes out of DFW when the plane started to shake violently. I checked everything and found nothing wrong. There was no storm activity or air currents that could account for it. Then, as soon as it all began, everything went quiet. It felt like flying a simulator rather than a real plane. Not even the vibration of the engine could be felt. I called into Houston for any weather updates, and all I got was an eerie static. Then a melodic tone came across the speakers. Time seemed to stop, or at least it was moving so slowly that I couldn't perceive it. I looked out the side window, and it was then I noticed for the first time that the sun was in the wrong place. It should have been overhead this time of day, but there it was, due west of my present position. Looking around the plain, I could see a faint green hue. And of course, there was silence. Freaky, cold silence. I wanted to scream, but I held my wits and tried to bank the plane to the right, to get out of whatever it was that held me. No response. The controls were like limp noodles in my hands. This went on for what seemed like hours, or was it seconds? I really don't know. I have dreams about this day all of the time, some more terrifying than others. Finally, when I thought I couldn't stand it any longer, I burst out of the green sphere. The plane surged and shook. The engine roared as if it had just took air for the very first time. I began a downward spiral and nearly lost total control. But finally, ever so slowly, the plane began to respond. It was then I realized I had not been breathing. I took a deep swallow, nearly passed out, but again my training took over, and I was able to fully recover the aircraft. The first thing I did was check my location and time. Not a second had passed. I was at the same position at the time when the shaking had first begun. All of the logbooks recorded a perfect flight. Houston had never lost my signal, and the same was true with Dallas. I made the rest of the trip with no issues, and I even got my $600 bonus. Jim Richards, Atlanta, Georgia. Jim went on to say that when he landed, he didn't go get his steak. In fact, he rented a car and drove back to Fort Worth. He had his plane flown home by a friend, and for the next year only worked in the office. After some extensive personal therapy, he was able to climb into the cockpit again, but he says he has never gotten over his experience. Well, Jim, that is an incredible tale. Thank you for sharing this with us. It sends a chill down my spine each time I read it. Our last story for this week comes from Travis Couch, who lives in the great state of California. Travis has called his story, "What Did I Just See?" Hello, Ron. I have a story that I've wanted to tell for a very long time. You and my fellow listeners are who I've chosen to tell it to. Have you ever looked up into the night sky and realized that you are a living, breathing person, and coming to that conclusion made you feel very small? That's how I felt one night looking up to the stars from the Mojave Desert. I was camping with my then girlfriend, Jenny. If you've never camped in the Mojave, I highly recommend it. It is a spiritual experience, to be sure. Jenny was asleep. I was sitting alone tending the fire when I had those very thoughts. I was in awe by the sight of the universe, and I couldn't believe that I was alive. It was then I started hearing a bell. It was like a church bell ringing out, calling me to service. I looked around and I couldn't see anything that could have possibly made such a noise. Then, in the distance, I saw a weak light coming towards me. It was swaying back and forth. As it got closer, I could hear the sound of wagon wheels, and closer still, I could see the wagon itself. It had a ghostly, yellowish hue. I could see the shadowed shape of a man sitting on the seat. It was being drawn by a single black horse. Strange. The closer it came, the harder it was to see. By the time it was 100 feet away, it had nearly faded completely. But I could still hear the wheels and horse's hooves strike the rocky surface. Then it all stopped. I came to myself and stayed up a while longer, looking up into the night sky. The thought that was going through my head? Well, what did I just see? Travis Couch, California. Well, Travis, I have no idea, but your description had chills running up and down my spine. Truly a one-of-a-kind story of the unknown. Thank you for allowing us to be the first to hear your story. Well, those are your tales for this time. If you have a story that you want to share, just head to the main website at ronsamazingstories.com and click on the story submission banner. And please remember to name your tale and tell me where you're from. We love your stories and we want to hear them.
Johnny, is this true?
As you know by now, I like to surf the internet to find the strange and unusual. I do this in the name of the podcast, but the truth is, I would do it anyway, even if there was no podcast. What you're about to hear is...
Johnny, is this true?
I will tell you a story and then ask the question, did I make it up or is it true? Your job is to decide. Let's get started.
Johnny, is this true?
Continuing on the theme of the unknown, on Johnny, is it true, we take this a bit further. I will tell you a story, and all you have to do is tell me if the story is known or if I made it up. Story 1. A woman in Sweden lost her wedding ring while cooking for a Christmas dinner in 1995. She looked everywhere for it and even had her kitchen floor pulled up in hopes that she could find it. But she wouldn't see the ring again until 2012. While gardening 16 years later, she found the ring in the middle of a carrot that was sprouting in her beautiful garden. Surely I made this up, right? Can't be true. Wrong. This actually happened, and there is photographic evidence to prove it. The only explanation is that the ring must have been lost in vegetable peelings that had been turned into compost. Clearly, composting isn't just good for our environment. Story 2. Did you know that you're more likely to get a computer virus from visiting religious sites than porn sites? Surely I made this one up. Nope, I didn't. According to research from the security firm Symantec, religious sites carry 3 times more malware threats than pornography sites. Symantec found that the average number of security threats on religious sites was about 115, compared to adult content, which carried around 25. In fact, only 2.4% of adult sites were infected with malware. The researchers hypothesized that because porn sites need to generate profit, there's a financial incentive to keep them virus-free to encourage repeat business. Story 3. In 1966, Frederick Bauer developed an ingenious idea for Procter & Gamble to uniformly stack chips inside a can instead of tossing them in a bag. He created what is called today Pringles. Bauer was so proud of his invention that he wanted to take it to the grave. Literally. At the age of 89, he passed away and was buried in, yep, you guessed it, a Pringles can. No, he wasn't. Or was he? He was. Hard as it is to believe, he communicated his burial wishes to his family, and when he died, his children stopped at a Walgreens on the way to the funeral home to buy his burial Pringles can. They did have one decision to make. Bauer's eldest son, Larry, told Time magazine, "My siblings and I briefly debated over what flavor to use, but I said, look, we need to use the original," which they did. Story 4. In 2005, one Powerball drawing had a shocking 110 second-place winners who all attributed their luck to a cookie. The folks at Powerball were extremely suspicious. Typically, there are only 4 or 5 second-place winners. However, there was no foul play involved. Now, is this even possible, or did I just make it up? This actually happened. Wonton Food, a Chinese fortune cookie distribution factory in Long Island City, just so happened to correctly foretell 5 of the 6 winning numbers. "We were so excited," Ho Ling Si said. "I knew people took our lucky numbers seriously. It shows that they really do tell fortunes, and we're so happy that people have benefited." Each winner took home between $100,000 and $500,000, depending on how much they bet. How about that? That's it for this edition of Johnny Is It True? I hope you got them all right, and I thank you for listening. Do you have any strange but true stories you want to share? If you do, send them to ronsamazingstories@gmail.com, and I'll use them if I can.
This is the Edsel. Its classic vertical grille, its elegant lines promise superb performance, and the Edsel keeps that promise on the road. These high-compression, high-torque engines are just one of many things that make driving an Edsel a great experience. To shift while both hands stay at the wheel. To feel the solid sureness of this beautifully engineered automobile. To sensibly test the potential of the newest engines in the world is something no man should miss. Your Edsel dealer invites you to take the Edsel for an introductory drive. This week, Road Test, the new member of the Ford family of fine cars, the Edsel, at your Edsel dealer.
Our featured story today fits well into the category of the unknown, but with a twist. When this story was written, the world was a very different place. It was the beginning of the Cold War. When Eisenhower entered office in 1953, he was committed to maintaining or even heightening the national movement to counter the spread of Soviet influence. In a nutshell, to end communism. But there was a problem. The world had just been given the atomic bomb, and because of this, Earth's fate was an unknown. Our story looks at this from the point of view of a banker whose pre-apocalypse isn't all that great. So let's see how that changes after the Great War. The story is called Time Enough at Last and was first published in If magazine, January of 1953. It was written by Lyn Venable and is read for us by Roger Meelan.
For a long time, Henry Bemis had had an ambition: to read a book. Not just the title or the preface or a page somewhere in the middle, He wanted to read the whole thing, all the way through from beginning to end. A simple ambition, perhaps, but in the cluttered life of Henry Bemis, an impossibility. Henry had no time of his own. There was his wife, Agnes, who owned that part of it that his employer, Mr. Carsville, did not buy. Henry was allowed enough to get to and from work, that in itself being quite a concession on Agnes's part. Also, nature had conspired against Henry by handing him with a pair of hopelessly myopic eyes. Poor Henry literally couldn't see his hand in front of his face. For a while, when he was very young, his parents had thought him an idiot. When they realized it was his eyes, they got glasses for him. He was never quite able to catch up. There was never enough time. It looked as though Henry's ambition would never be realized. Then something happened which changed all that. Henry was down in the vault of the East Side Bank and Trust when it happened. He had stolen a few moments from the duties of his teller's cage to try to read a few pages of the magazine he had bought that morning. He'd made an excuse to Mr. Carsville about needing bills in large denominations for a certain customer, and then, safe inside the dim recesses of the vault, he had pulled from inside his coat the pocket-size magazine. He had just started a picture article cheerfully entitled, "The New Weapons and What They'll Do to You," when all the noise in the world crashed in upon his eardrums. It seemed to be inside of him and outside of him all at once. Then the concrete floor was rising up at him and the ceiling came slanting down toward him, and for a fleeting second Henry thought of a story he had started to read once called The Pit and the Pendulum. He regretted in that insane moment that he had never had time to finish that story to see how it came out. Then all was darkness and quiet and unconsciousness. When Henry came to, he knew that something was desperately wrong with the East Side Bank and Trust. The heavy steel door of the vault was buckled and twisted, and the floor tilted up at a dizzy angle, while the ceiling dipped crazily toward it. Henry gingerly got to his feet, moving arms and legs experimentally. Assured that nothing was broken, he tenderly raised a hand to his eyes. His precious glasses were intact, thank God. He would never have been able to find his way out of the shattered vault without them. He made a mental note to write Dr. Torrance to have a spare pair made and mailed to him. Blasted nuisance not having his prescription on file locally, but Henry trusted no one but Dr. Torrance to grind those thick lenses into his own complicated prescription. Henry removed the heavy glasses from his face. Instantly the room dissolved into a neutral blur. Henry saw a pink splash that he knew was his hand, and a white blob come up to meet the pink as he withdrew his pocket handkerchief and carefully dusted the lenses. As he replaced the glasses, they slipped down on the bridge of his nose a little. He had been meaning to have them tightened for some time. He suddenly realized, without the realization actually entering his conscious thoughts, that something momentous had happened, something worse than the boiler blowing up, something worse than a gas main exploding, something worse than anything that had ever happened before. He felt that way because it was so quiet. There was no whine of sirens, no shouting, no running, just an ominous and all-pervading silence. Henry walked across the slanting floor. Slipping and stumbling on the uneven surface, he made his way to the elevator. The car lay crumpled at the foot of the shaft like a discarded accordion. There was something inside of it that Henry could not look at, something that had once been a person, or perhaps several people. It was impossible to tell now. Feeling sick, Henry staggered toward the stairway. The steps were still there, but so jumbled and piled back upon one another that it was more like climbing the side of a mountain than mounting a stairway. It was quiet in the huge chamber that had been the lobby of the bank. It looked strangely cheerful with the sunlight shining through the girders where the ceiling had fallen. The dappled sunlight glinted across the silent lobby, and everywhere there were huddled lumps of unpleasantness that made Henry sick as he tried not to look at them. "Mr. Carsville," he called. It was very quiet. Something had to be done, of course. This was terrible, right in the middle of a Monday, too. Mr. Carsville would know what to do. He called again, more loudly, and his voice cracked hoarsely. "Mr. Carsville!" And then he saw an arm and shoulder extending out from under a huge fallen block of marble ceiling. In the buttonhole was the white carnation Mr. Carsville had worn to work that morning, and on the third finger of that hand was a massive signet ring, also belonging to Mr. Carsville. Numbly, Henry realized that the rest of Mr. Carsville was under that block of marble. Henry felt a pang of real sorrow. Mr. Carsville was gone, and so was the rest of the staff, Mr. Wilkinson and Mr. Emery and Mr. Prithard, and the same with Pete and Ralph and Jenkins and Hunter and Pat the guard and Willie the doorman. There was no one to say what was to be done about the East Side Bank and Trust except Henry Bemis. And Henry wasn't worried about the bank. There was something he wanted to do. He climbed carefully over piles of fallen masonry. Once he stepped down into something that crunched and squashed beneath his feet, and he set his teeth on edge to keep from retching. The street was not much different from the inside. Bright sunlight and so much concrete to crawl over, but the unpleasantness was much, much worse. Everywhere there were strange, motionless lumps that Henry could not look at. Suddenly he remembered Agnes. He should be trying to get to Agnes, shouldn't he? He remembered a poster he had seen that said, "In event of emergency, do not use the telephone. Your loved ones are as safe as you." He wondered about Agnes. He looked at the smashed automobiles, some with their 4 wheels pointing skyward like the stiffened legs of dead animals. He couldn't get to Agnes now anyway. If she was safe, then she was safe. Otherwise... Of course, Henry knew Agnes wasn't safe. He had a feeling that there wasn't anyone safe for a long, long way, maybe not in the whole state, or the whole country, or the whole world. No, that was a thought Henry didn't want to think. He forced it from his mind and turned his thoughts back to Agnes. She had been a pretty good wife, now that it was all said and done. It wasn't exactly her fault if people didn't have time to read nowadays. It was just that there was the house and the bank and the yard. There were the Joneses for bridge and the Graysons for canasta and charades with the Bryants, and the television Agnes loved to watch, but would never watch alone. He never had time to read even a newspaper. He started thinking about last night, that business about the newspaper. Henry had settled into his chair quietly, afraid that a creaking spring might call to Agnes's attention the fact that he was momentarily unoccupied. He had unfolded the newspaper slowly and carefully. The sharp crackle of the paper would have been a clarion call to Agnes. He had glanced at the headlines of the first page. "Collapse of Conference Imminent." He didn't have time to read the article. He turned to the second page. "Solon predicts war only days away." He flipped through the pages faster, reading brief snatches here and there, afraid to spend too much time on any one item. On a back page was a brief article entitled, "Prehistoric Artifacts Unearthed in Yucatan." Henry smiled to himself and carefully folded the sheet of paper into fourths. That would be interesting. He would read all of it. Then it came, Agnes's voice. "Henry!" And then she was upon him. She lightly flicked the paper out of his hands and into the fireplace. He saw the flames lick up and curl possessively around the unread article. Agnes continued, "Henry, tonight is the Joneses' bridge night." They'll be here in 30 minutes, and I'm not dressed yet, and here you are, reading." She had emphasized the last word as though it were an unclean act. "Hurry and shave, you know how smooth Jasper Jones's chin always looks, and then straighten up this room." She glanced regretfully toward the fireplace. "Oh dear, that paper, the television schedule. Oh well, after the Jones leave there won't be time for anything but the Late Late movie, and don't just sit there, Henry. Hurry!" Henry was hurrying now, but hurrying too much. He cut his leg on a twisted piece of metal that had once been an automobile fender. He thought about things like lockjaw and gangrene, and his hand trembled as he tied his pocket handkerchief around the wound. In his mind he saw the fire again, licking across the face of last night's newspaper. He thought that now he would have time to read all the newspapers he wanted to, only now there wouldn't be any more. That heap of rubble across the street had been the Gazette building. It was terrible to think that there would never be another up-to-date newspaper. Agnes would have been very upset. No television schedule. But then, of course, no television. He wanted to laugh, but he didn't. That wouldn't have been fitting, not at all. He could see the building he was looking for now, but the silhouette was strangely changed. The great circular dome was now a ragged semicircle, half of it gone, and one of the great wings of the building had fallen in upon itself. A sudden panic gripped Henry Bemis. What if they were all ruined, destroyed, every one of them? What if there wasn't a single one left? Tears of helplessness welled in his eyes as he painfully fought his way over and through the twisted fragments of the city. He thought of the building when it had been whole. He remembered the many nights he had paused outside its wide and welcoming doors. He thought of the warm nights when the doors had been thrown open and he could see the people inside, see them sitting at the plain wooden tables with the stacks of books beside them. He used to think then what a wonderful thing a public library was, a place where anybody at all could go in and read. He had been tempted to enter many times. He had watched the people through the open doors, the man in greasy work clothes who sat near the door, night after night, laboriously studying, a technical journal perhaps, difficult for him, but promising a brighter future. There had been an aged, scholarly gentleman who sat on the other side of the door, leisurely paging, moving his lips a little as he did so, a man having little time left, but rich in time because he could do with it as he chose. Henry had never gone in. He had started up the steps once, got almost to the door, but then he remembered Agnes, her questions and shouting, and he had turned away. He was going in now, though, almost crawling, his breath coming in stabbing gasps, his hands torn and bleeding. His trouser leg was sticky red where the wound in his leg had soaked through the handkerchief. It was throbbing badly, but Henry didn't care. He had reached his destination. Part of the inscription was still there, over the now doorless entrance. PUBCLIBR. The rest had been torn away. The place was in shambles. The shelves were overturned, broken, smashed, tilted, their precious contents spilled in disorder upon the floor. A lot of the books, Henry noted gleefully, were still intact, still whole, still readable. He was literally knee-deep in them. He wallowed in books. He picked one up. The title was Collected Works of William Shakespeare. Yes, he must read that sometime. He laid it aside carefully. He picked up another. Spinoza. He tossed it away, seized another, and still another. Which to read first? There were so many. He had been conducting himself a little like a starving man in a delicatessen, grabbing a little of this and a little of that in a frenzy of enjoyment. But now he steadied away. From the pile about him, he selected one volume, sat comfortably down on an overturned shelf, and opened the book. Henry Bemis smiled. There was the rumble of complaining stone. Minute in comparison with the epic complaints following the fall of the bomb, this one occurred under one corner of the shelf upon which Henry sat. The shelf moved, threw him off balance. The glasses slipped from his nose and fell with a tinkle. He bent down, clawing blindly, and found, finally, their smashed remains. A minor, indirect destruction stemming from the sudden, wholesale smashing of a city, but the only one that greatly interested Henry Bemis. He stared down at the blurred page before him. He began to cry.
Did that story seem familiar to you? It should. It was adapted to television and became one of the most famous episodes of The Twilight Zone in 1959. The episode starred Burgess Meredith. It is frequently played today on stations like the Sci-Fi Channel and MeTV. This one has been tirelessly discussed by scholars who note that it was published in the same year as Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, which, by coincidence, is also about the fate of books. After hearing this version, one has to wonder what author Lyn Venable would think about our society today. It's something to think about. That was episode number 447, and I want to say a thank you to Eva and Ella Stone, Jim Richards, Travis Couch, and Roger Meelan. You guys did good. If you want to follow the podcast or the blog, head to ronsamazingstories.com. There you will find any of the links I mentioned and how to contact us. Do you want to help the show? The best thing you can do is to tell your friends all about it, and please leave reviews or feedback wherever you listen. Clicking that follow or like button makes us grow. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come again to find out what are Ron's Amazing Stories.